When we last left you in December of 1964, Brian Wilson was recovering from a panic attack/nervous breakdown, and this was a result from nervous exhaustion from working too hard and from a shaky marriage. At the beginning of 1965, things got back to a relative normal as they added Glenn Campbell to be Brian's replacement on the road, and they got back into the studio to start recording their next album, The Beach Boys Today. It was during these sessions that Brian declared to the band that he'd be withdrawing from the live shows and only working in the studio for an indefinite period of time. And the band reacted rather emotionally to this, and I don't think they expected it. And once they calmed down in this meeting, I think they all understood why and that it was a good thing for both parties. The only problem is that Murray, Brian's father, accused him of abandoning his responsibilities to the band. But here's what Brian said. "I foresee a beautiful future for the Beach Boys, but the only way we can achieve it was if they did their job and I did mine." Brian later told a journalist that his decision to quit touring was because of his effed up jealousy over the Beatles and Phil Spector. And Brian was determined to compete with them, and he realized to do that he had to have more time in the studio producing and writing. And with Brian now out of the touring part of the Beach Boys, Mike Love took over much of the responsibilities of the on-the-road duties. One of the other reasons that deterred Brian from the stage was his jealousy over his brother Dennis and all the adulation he got and all the girl fans, because Dennis was really good looking and Brian was not as much, so that made him insecure. And now with all the chart-topping songs that they had, including the #1 hit I Get Around from '64, and despite Brian stepping back from playing live, he still received an equal share of the proceeds. Their next album, Beach Boys Today, was released in early 1965, in March, and this was a little bit different. There were more ballads and a little more introspection on this album. And earlier when Brian was working with Jan and Dean, he got used to them using session musicians. And for this album, Brian started to employ some session musicians sprinkled throughout this album. Now, in the first couple of years, in '63 and '64, some session musicians were used here and there, but largely was the Beach Boys on those recordings. By using a little bit more session players on this album, made the sound slightly more sophisticated and a little deeper. I gotta dance, 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 now the beats really right on the spot. Dance, 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 right there. This will I grow up to be. Don't Hurt My Little Sister was originally written for the Ronettes. And side 1 of this album contained a lot more commercial upbeat songs, while side 2 contained the ballads with more introspection and more gentleness. Now you can probably tell that the arrangements here are slower and richer and not really the standard rock instrumentation. Now the Beach Boys do play on many of these tracks, aided by some studio musicians, and namely Brian and Carl are on pretty much every track. Carl has been becoming much more proficient on guitar and has a big interest in recording in the studio, so you can usually find him on every track. And then there was only 2 non-originals on this album. All the songs were written by Mike and Brian. The album ends on an odd note, eavesdropping on the band on a song called Bull Session with the Big Daddy.
Hi, Fig. I leave. Food. Give my cheese sandwich. Did they have one?
They have one.
Did you get them all?
Now, including a non-music track on Beach Boys albums had become kind of a bad habit with the band when they could have included a song like this one. The way I act don't seem like me. Guess I'm Dumb was given to Glenn Campbell to record as a thank you for helping them out on the road when Brian was ill. And this song was intended for the Beach Boys, but none of the band members wanted to sing it. I don't know why Brian just didn't sing it, but he opted to give it to Glenn Campbell, who did a great job on it, and it didn't chart, unfortunately, so I guess it didn't have much appeal. But it would have been so much more appropriate to have that song close the album, Beach Boys Today, rather than Bull Session with the Big Daddy. Even though their father Murray had been fired as manager some months earlier, he was still a bit in the mix. And one way he was in the mix had to do with the publishing of the music. Now, you may have noticed across many of these songs I've mentioned that Mike Love was a co-writer on many of these songs. The problem was that he wasn't given credit on the label and therefore did not get any publishing. Now, Mike would tell Brian, he said, Brian, we got to fix this. I'm co-writing these songs with you and I'm not getting any credit. And Brian was put in the bad position of having to deal with his father on this topic. And it either kept getting pushed off or Murray just ignored it. But this was an issue that was not resolved at this time. Nonetheless, the band pushed forward with a revamped version of Help Me Rhonda with Al Jardine on lead vocals. It was quite a feather in their cap when Help Me Rhonda knocked the Beatles' Help out of the #1 slot on Billboard. But as far as film went, there's a huge chasm in between what the Beach Boys were doing on film and what the Beatles were doing on film.
She loves the monkey's uncle. Call us a couple of missing links. She loves...
By spring of 1965, Glenn Campbell had turned down an offer to permanently join the Beach Boys, and they turned their eyes to staff writer Bruce Johnston, who was also a studio musician. He had played with Kim Fowley and Sandy Nelson, worked with Phil Spector, and he had a project with partner Terry Melcher in the Ripcords. So he's familiar with surf songs and car songs, was a great singer, so he was the perfect addition for the Beach Boys. With the Beach Boys constantly on the road, Brian started to distance himself from his bandmates, and he started to form a new social circle through industry connections, and these new connections turned him on to marijuana. Now, this was something that he kept hidden from his family and friends initially. As Brian said, smoking a bit of pot changed the way I heard arrangements. It opened some doors for me, and I got a little more committed to the music than I had before. As his new social circle expanded, Brian started to chase what he considered to be enlightened people. Now, enlightened people in these circles meant those that had tried LSD. And the first enlightened person that he befriended was a guy named Lawrence Schwartz. Now, Schwartz was employed by the William Morris Agency, and that was the same agency that represented the Beach Boys and managed them. Schwartz is very happy to take credit for giving Brian his first LSD dose. And after he took that dose, when he came home the next morning, he was telling his wife Marilyn that he had his mind blown and that he had found God. This was not a good start to their marriage, as Marilyn did not trust this Lawrence Schwartz and tried to keep Brian away from him. And it got so bad that she actually separated from Brian and moved out of the house for a month. The drugs had an immediate effect on Brian's approach to music, and it can be heard on the intro to their next single, California Girls. There's some conflicting information as to when Brian actually wrote the intro to this song. In one account, he says that he took the LSD and right away went to the piano and wrote the song. In another incident, he said that he wrote it a week after, completely sober. So I guess it doesn't matter. It's a great intro, possibly the greatest intro of any song in the decade.
I wish they all could be California.
Now, surprisingly, this song only got to number 3. I mean, it had #1 written all over it, but it was kept out of the top of the charts by the Beatles' Help and by Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan. And he was disappointed it didn't make #1, but he always referred to this as maybe the best piece of music he's ever written. And it set the tone for the album that they were about to record. And here's the next album, Summer Days and Summer Nights. This was released on the same day as the California Girls single.
And I said, California guys all got their eyes on that grill from New York City. And LA, I met you last summer when I came up to stay with my friend. You're kind of small and you're such a doll. I'm glad you're mine. Now it's getting late.
Now, those 4 songs just feature the Beach Boys. There are no session guys on those songs. And one of my favorite songs of the Beach Boys is Girl Don't Tell Me. It's got a little birdsy jangle to it.
And when I heard you talk with him, I couldn't stand his lies. Salt Lake City will be coming soon.
first three songs do feature session musicians, so the band is still kind of finding themselves in the studio. And like the previous studio albums, they added a comedy track on here called I'm Bugged at My Old Man.
I'm bugged at my old man, 'cause he's making me stay in my room.
Bruce Johnston was subbing for Brian in the live shows, but he was also playing on this album. And he is not featured on this album cover because of a contractual arrangement. And Al Jardine is not on this cover either, so I'm not quite sure why. Such a great cover and kind of an important cover that you hate to not have the whole band on it. Now, these last three regular studio albums are, I think, an important trilogy. And oftentimes they either get underrated and get lumped in with the surf and the car songs, which they really are not, or they get overrated. Like I always say, the very great bands are really judged on their deep cuts, and these albums have plenty of them. Now, there's still some stinkers on here, and you have to remember that Rubber Soul is still a couple months off yet, and that is the album that really defined album-oriented rock. And these albums were really not considered conceptual or groundbreaking at the time. Now, I want to point out that one of the stories we hear today about this trilogy is that Capitol wanted the Beach Boys to return to a more commercial sound on this album because the Beach Boys today sold under expectations. Now, I can't quite believe that because the numbers don't bear that out. If you look at the actual numbers, these three studio albums all sold very well. They all went gold. They all were in the top 5 on Billboard. They all had hit singles. They all featured both a mix of studio musicians and the Beach Boys. So these are three of the most consistent albums that they probably had. And this trilogy does mark a step forward for the band because they did kind of shed that car song, surf song image that they had, or so they thought musically. But the competition at the time was very stiff. You had the Byrds who had just come out, which were huge. You had the Lovin' Spoonful, and you had Dylan going rock. So the competition was very stiff. And unfortunately, the public often saw the Beach Boys still as that striped shirt wearing surf band. By fall of 1965, another album was needed for the holiday season, but the band had no new material ready. So they contemplated doing maybe another live album, but they ruled that out, having done one the year before. Capitol suggested they do a greatest hits album, but the Beach Boys decided to do a live in the studio party type of album. And Brian was really driving this, and he thought that it'd be a good idea to do a series of cover songs that they could play with acoustic instruments and record it as if it were live. This concept killed two birds with one stone. It kept them visible with some new product, and it also allowed Brian to concentrate on his next project. Meanwhile, he took his production to another level with the next single called The Little Girl I Once Knew.
I'm gonna try for her. Look out, babe. She's not the little girl I once knew. She's not.
Now, John Lennon really praised this track at Melody Maker, saying, "This is the greatest. Turn it up. It's got to be a hit. It's the greatest record I've heard for weeks. It's all Brian Wilson. He just uses the voices as instruments. He never tours or anything. He just sits at home thinking of fantastic arrangements out of his head. You keep waiting for the fabulous breaks. Great arrangement. I hope it's a hit so I can hear it all the time." Now, George Harrison also had this 45 on his jukebox. But unfortunately, not only was it not a hit in the UK, it didn't even chart there. Now in the US, it charted at number 20 and got up to number 15 in Cashbox. But it's been reported that DJs felt that the starts and stops were like dead air and they kept it out of some of their playlists. But a more likely explanation is that most fans didn't find it as engaging as John Lennon found it. And it simply doesn't have the hit potential of like a Help Me Rhonda or a California Girls, so I can see why it charted at number 20. That seems about the right place for it. Now, this was the lowest entry for an A-side for the Beach Boys since the abominable 10 Little Indians in 1963. The Little Girl I Once Knew strikes me more as just as a very good album track, like what the world was about to see with the album tracks on Rubber Soul, about 1 week later. So the Beach Boys Party was released in November of 1965, and here it is, here live, recorded, quote, live at a Beach Boys party. Kind of a nice gatefold here with nice band pictures. And they had a lot of guests on this album, like Dean Torrance and Billy Hinchy, Terry Melcher, Marilyn Wilson. And they recorded this in about 3 weeks.
Around like an awful disease. Holy girlie. Oh, there's no
That was Dennis's soulful vocal on the Beatles' You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. And it's really too bad that they didn't record that song properly because Dennis really does justice to it. Now, overall, this is a fairly weak but charming album. And they were having fun with bongos and guitars. And there's not even a drummer on this album. There are no drums on this album to show you that they weren't taking it that seriously. It did what it was intended to do, and this party atmosphere predates Marvin Gaye's What's Going On by about 5 years. Meanwhile, The Little Girl I Once Knew entered Billboard charts on the week of November 22nd and spent only 8 weeks on the charts and started falling off the charts in its 6th week. Unbeknownst to the Beach Boys, radio disc jockeys started playing the song Barbara Ann straight off the album, and listener response was so strong that Capitol Rush released it when they heard that radio programmers were really playing the heck out of it. Now, my personal introduction to the Beach Boys was the single Barbara Ann, and I don't know where I got it from, but I got it secondhand, and maybe my dad got it for me, but I remember the Capitol label, and I used to play it all the time, and I was 6 years old, and I used to take it to grade school with me and hope my teacher would play it for art class, and I started to play the B-side a lot. I preferred Girl Don't Tell Me over Barbara Ann after not very long. And it was kind of a love song, and I gave it to a girl that I really liked. Her name was Ingrid. Unfortunately, she moved away and I never saw her again. So Ingrid, if you're out there, flip the record over and play the B-side. The Beach Boys' Party was a big hit number 6 in the United States and number 3 in the UK. However, it was the first album to not go gold in the United States since their first album. So people don't really talk about this as being a failure because it's not an artistic album, so it's not given much credibility. And one thing Capitol did to promote this album was to give away bags of potato chips with the album artwork on the bag. So that was their idea of promoting the Beach Boys. Meanwhile, the Beatles had Rubber Soul, which came out shortly after this, which only took 1 week longer to record than this album, by the way. And publications like Newsweek heralded the Beatles as the bards of pop, and the reviews were glowing. And the Beach Boys had this kind of loose party album out there that must have seemed trite by comparison. But fans had no way of knowing that Brian was plotting his next move that would put the Beach Boys back on the top of the pop world. We're going to find out more about that in the next edition here on Pop Goes the 60s.